it's me, Maddy, and today I'm going to show you how I made my elf costume. I first started by draping my fabric onto my dress form to create the front panel of the cloak. After pinning my design, I cut the piece out and sewed my darts together. After completing the front pieces, I moved on to draping the back of the cloak. For this, I used the remnant fabric and created 2 long panels. After cutting each panel out, I sewed the back together and then attached each of the front panels to the back pieces at both the shoulders and the sides. Once I sewed the basic structure of the cloak together, I chose to finish the side seams and shoulder seams with a basic straight stitch. I also chose to finish the center back with some decorative stitching, which ended up being a pretty long and tedious process. To clean up the raw edges of the cloak, I wanted to use some of this faux leather. I decided to cut the leather into 1-inch strips and then sew it together. My plan was to have the red strips act as a collar, while the brown strips would trail down the remaining of the cloak. Once I finished attaching the strips together, I sewed it to the cloak with a decorative stitch. While this did end up taking quite a bit of time, I think it paid off in the end. Surprisingly, I did have some remaining strips of the leather, which I used to trim the bottom sides and center of the cloak. I also wanted to add a little bit more detailing besides the leather trim, so I did end up adding some detail stitching to cover up the pre-hemmed material. Moving on to the sleeves, for my measurements I measured from the top of my shoulder blade down to the top of my hand. This ended up being 21 inches. For the inner sleeve, I measured 6 inches, and for the length of my sleeve, I ended up measuring 26 inches. I then drew a rough sketch of this onto my fabric and cut it out. I cut out 4 pieces and then sewed the center seams together. After this, I folded over about 6 inches of the sleeve and cut it out onto my lining material. Continued by layering the lining piece on top of the outer sleeve piece. I then sewed it together and added a trim from the remaining pieces of my leather. Once this was finished, I pretty much sewed the inner seams together and completed the sleeve. To finish the raw edges, I used remaining trim from a previous project I was working on. I pretty much overlapped it and sewed it on to the sleeve like you would with bias tape. For the skirt, I pretty much used a basic skirt pattern I had on hand. I made it out of a sheet, sewed the center back seams together and the center side seams together. And then I continued by hand pleating the skirt on my dress form to create the illusion of a flared back. Once the pleating was done, I hand tacked each pleat into place and then sewed it on my sewing machine. For the waistband, I used some remaining polyester material I had on hand and attached it to the raw edges of the top of the skirt. I used an old table runner as the main body for the corset. For the sides of the corset, I used an ombre woven silk, and for the trim around the corset, I used a white glitter sateen from an old table runner. I decided to cut the center front of the corset onto the side of the table runner instead of on the inner fold to create a more medieval looking style. Because I had limited material, I only cut the center back pieces and the side back pieces out of this material. I also think the design fared better like this in the end, once all my pieces were cut out. I used the white sateen runner to cut out a slightly larger version of the original pattern. This way I could use the decorative hem on the table runner as a decorative trim on my finished corset. I then sewed the corset and decorative lining center back pieces together with a decorative finishing stitch. I repeated this process with all the other pieces except the center front. Once all the raw hemming was done, I attached the center back to the side back with a straight stitch. I then finished the stitch on the outer side with a decorative stitch. After this, I sewed the side back to the side center pieces and finished it like I did the other pieces. To accent the center front, I cut out a fan-shaped motif from some remnant upholstery fabric I had. I decided to layer this on top of a thin strip of sateen to give the impression of a false closure. I first attached each side of the center front to the white sateen strip, and then I finished it with a straight stitch. After completing this step, I sewed the darts of the corset before raw hemming the motif onto the sateen strip. Once this was completed, I added a strip of hem sateen and raw hemmed it to the base of the corset. I then attached the other completed pieces to the center front of the corset to form the body of the garment. I then trimmed the collar of the corset with some remaining sateen. I repeated this step with both shoulders of the corset to cover all raw edges. Finally, I trimmed the center and side back of the corset. After my trimming was completed, I sewed the straps together. And this completed the basic body of the corset. For closures, I added some extra large snaps. And after that was completed, I moved on to the hood. For the hood, I used a tassel and a table runner. To make the back of the hood more rounded, I sewed a curve up the side. I then sewed 2 loops out of some teal ribbon and attached them to the sides of the top of the hood so I could use it as a closure. To create a more defined silhouette, I added elastic around the curve. And then to strengthen the hood, I added some zip ties to act as boning to give the hood a little more structure and durability. And that's it. That's the finished hood and costume.